Reddit is a network of communities where people can dive into their interests, hobbies, and passions. However, parts of these forums are dedicated to the many unique stories of everyday people. Hello, my twinkling stars, and welcome to the very first official episode of your evening Reddit readings. I'm your host Dusk, and in this video we'll be looking into r/Prorevenge, a subreddit dedicated to people getting stone cold revenge against the people that have wronged them. The stories that will be covered in this video will be a lawyer's revenge against an abusive spouse, a man getting fired over a parking space, and a scammer being forced to pay nearly 4 times the amount that OP got scammed out of. Let's call him Joe. I have to call him something, the man I ruined, but I can't call him by his real name, so let's call him Joe. Joe was a wife beater. I was hired by Joe's brother-in-law, the brother of the wife that Joe beat. My client was also Joe's ex-business partner. Aside from the whole "you beat up my sister" thing, my clients had another beef with Joe, a serious business beef. My clients took it to court and gave me the case to handle. Joe and his lawyers fought me long and hard. Joe was confident that his bullshit and outright perjury would carry the day. It had always worked before. His bullshit and his fists had won him a good settlement with his ex-wife, free of child support, so maybe he thought that threats and lies would carry the day once more. But he was wrong, and after the trial I had a judgment against him. A big judgment, far bigger than he could pay. Joe twisted and he turned and he shimmied and shaked, but after a while I had located him and taken all of his assets. It was easy really. Joe had no thought of consequences, and so he didn't lawyer up until it was too late. If one of my clients ever sues you, you're in trouble because my clients lawyer up before they even know your name. But Joe didn't lawyer up until the process server threw the papers at his feet, and by then it was too late. I went through Joe's assets like a meat grinder, and after a while Joe had but one property left, a house, and he clung to that house, for it was rented out, and his sole source of income. Joe lived in the unfinished basement, and he survived on what the upstairs tenants paid him. He cashed the rent checks at payday loan places, paying hefty fees, but it was worth it, because he knew that I'd garnish any bank accounts that he had opened. Joe managed to hide his rental place from me for a while because he owned it through a numbered company, but my investigator found him one day and followed him home. Joe self-repped his way through the next stage, which took a couple of years while I punctured his corporate veils and his sad efforts at a fraudulent conveyance. But in the end, I had his last house, the house where he lived in the unfinished basement. Joe stepped out one day to get a pack of cigarettes. When he came back, the sheriff had to change the locks. "Can my client at least live in the basement?" Joe's lawyer said to me, pro bono, because at this point Joe had nothing to pay his lawyers. As I was talking to him, I could see pro bono guy's office window across the parking lot from my office tower window. "Ask the purchaser," I said. "It's out of my hands." And it was. I told Joe's lawyer that the new owner, a nominee, one of my client's employees, wouldn't let him back into his shitty basement apartment. I told Joe's lawyer that the new owner, who was a nominee and one of my client's employees, wouldn't let him back into his shitty basement apartment. Joe, a man who had owned this and that here and there and all over the town, had just lost the last thing he owned on Earth. Except for his truck. He still had his truck left. Joe's truck was this big-ass gas-guzzling beast that he drove around in. It was too old and too frail to be worth seizing, so I let Joe keep it. And I was glad I did that, because now the truck was where Joe slept. Until he made a mistake and lost his truck too. He lost his truck the day I got a phone call from the tenants at the house that Joe used to own. He'd parked his truck there in a range, out of spite, and then walked into town, saying he'd be back later that day to sleep in his truck. "Can you get around the truck?" I asked. The tenants could not. The driveway was blocked. I called one of the tow truck guys that I used to defend back in my criminal lawyer days, and in a couple of hours the truck was gone and parked somewhere else. Somewhere special in accordance with my specific instructions. "A guy wants his truck back," the pro bono lawyer said the next day he called me. "Not happening," I said. I stood in my office 15 floors above the parking lot. I looked down where I imagined my pro bono counterpart was standing in his office, facing the same lot. "But you have no right to the truck," he said. "He has no rights to block a man's driveway," I replied. It was terrible, really, standing up high, pronouncing words that took away a man's final asset, the last thing he owned on Earth. I imagined that this must be what God feels like before he strips a man of everything and sends him to hell. "Are you really gonna make me go to court over this?" said pro bono guy. Do what you gotta do, I said. And the pro bono guy said his client was coming in the next day to sign an affidavit. And then they were going to courts to get the truck back. But I was unconcerned. The next day was bright and the sun was shining, and it was 9 a.m. as I looked out the window and sipped my coffee. My phone rang. I picked it up, and it was Pro Bono Man. Why didn't you tell me that Joe's truck was parked right outside my office? His voice was tight, and I could tell that he must have been shaking with anger. Is that so? I said, staring out at Joe's truck parked 15 stories below me. How careless of my bailiff to leave the truck where your clients could easily take it back. I really must speak to him. Very funny. My client's going to sue. No, he isn't. He's going to get in that truck and drive away right now. I told my tow guy to fill up the tank, and he gave it an oil change too, gratis. Tell your clients to get in his truck and drive off, and that if I ever see that truck again, I'll seize it and to satisfy the rest of my client's judgments. Pro bono guy tried to argue, but I was firm. Then I put the phone down and picked up my coffee. A few minutes later, Joe walked out of his lawyer's office and over to his truck. As he walked, I saw that there was no longer a bounce in his step. The joy had gone out of him. Joe wasn't the first guy I ruined, and he won't be the last. But he is the only one whose final ruin I witnessed from on high, from my office. And it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life, watching a man walk to his truck, knowing that I had stripped him of everything else he had, and that he owed his possession of his last asset, his truck, to my mercy. Joe drove away, his big-ass ancient truck spilling clouds of smoke from the exhaust. I was pretty sure I'd never hear from him again, and I never did. Now, this story is more of a lawyer helping a client get revenge, but if you continuously assault your wife long enough to be known as a wife beater, then I'd say that the justice on Joe was definitely served well done on a cold silver platter. I am a professional driver. As such, on the roads in the US, there are different truck stops throughout the country that has a pay-to-park system, usually about 10 to 20% of the lots marked off as reserved, with each space running from $15 to $25. The truck stop where this took place had parking for $17, which is relatively cheap for a guaranteed spot. The spots are reserved for 24 hours, starting at 4 p.m. local time and extending to 3 p.m. on the following afternoon. I knew that I would have a late night's delivery, so I came to the truck stop at around 3:30 and paid for a reserved spot. I told the manager on duty that I had to delivery up the roads that night and would be back once delivery was completed, but should still be able to clear out the spots the next afternoon. She told me that this was okay and would mark the spots as sold when I left. That way, if someone else comes in trying to reserve the spot, she could consult her notes and deny the sale. 11:15 p.m. rolls around and I take off for my delivery. I don't get out of that facility until 2:30 a.m. the next morning. So I groggily drive back to the truck stop to reclaim my paid-for spot, only to find that the reserved parking spaces are all full. I call the manager on duty, and after giving her my info, inform her that all the spots are full and that someone has parked in the spots and hasn't paid for it. The culprit was from a company that is known for their bright orange trailers, and he was a company driver. The other employee starts banging on his door to inform him that he has parked illegally and he has to move. Meanwhile, I can see the commotion from my mirror, with my vantage point in the fuel island, where I had been instructed to temporarily park. The driver answers the door with a bottle of Heineken in one hand and some sort of smoking implement in his other hand. I decided to roll down the window to hear the commotion, and I hear the employee tell the driver to either move or he will get the towing company and police involved. This driver is flat out irate that someone had the audacity to tell him where he can and cannot park, so he slams the door on the employee, threatening him. The employee calls the police and tow company, and the police show up first. I had worked for this company before, so I know their policies, and more importantly, what they can and cannot have in their trucks. Alcoholic beverages are not allowed in the cab. Anything that is a cigarette or a cigar and a lighter is also not allowed. The coup de grace, a pew-pew of any kind, is absolutely not allowed, and especially not allowed loaded. This driver had all that, and some other not-so-legal substances in his cab, so he was hauled away in cuffs. His truck was hauled away on a wrecker. I made a call after the commotion died down to the company safety director and informs them that their rig will be in an impounded lot and their driver will be going to jail over the not-so-legal stuff he had in his truck. She thanked me and said that he will definitely lose his job, especially over the alcohol and the other not-so-legal stuff. I guess he played the screw around and find out card, and it bit him in his career. It is just as OP had said. The other driver played the cards he dealt himself by keeping the drugs, alcohol, and the loaded gun in his cab. There was no doubt that he would have been arrested for the aforementioned items, but he ultimately could have avoided all of that on top of not losing his job, had he simply not stolen a reserved parking spot that wasn't even his. From 2018 to 2022, I was a consistently broke pizza delivery guy. My common method for vehicles was to buy cars for less than $1,000, do minor repairs, and drive them for 3 to 6 months until they exploded. I'd make 10 times the value on the car and would rinse and repeat, and would do this for probably 7 or 8 times over the years. The only time I ever got burned was buying a '98 Civic Coupe. I remember that I was a little extra broke but needed a car for work that week, and Civics and Corollas were and are the easiest and cheapest for me to work on. I texted him and drove to Felony Flats in Portland, which was red flag number 1, and was greeted by a man with a gold grill, which was red flag number 2, who didn't speak much English, which wasn't helpful due to my poor Spanish. The car itself was pretty beat up cosmetically, but ran perfectly, so I gave him the $800 and headed to work. This is where the f***ing begins. The next day I head to the DOL to register the car, only to realize that the title was voided due to the car being in a wreck, so I wouldn't be able to register till I got the proper title. Annoying, but I figured he made an innocent mistake. I call him and leave a message saying there's issues with the title and he doesn't respond. I call him over 100 times over the next 2 weeks to get it figured out, but he keeps ignoring me. And at this point I figured I'd been had and moved the car to the public street to deal with another day. One morning, I come out to find tickets for no registration and no insurance left on the car, totaling $150 to $200 between the two. At first, I was enraged, until it dawned on me that the car wasn't in my name and those tickets weren't mine to deal with. So, I made a plan. Every few days, the car would get reticketed and tagged for towing. I would come out, place the tickets on the driver's seats, move the car by a few feet, and erase the tow warning. After 2-ish months, I had racked up about $2,000 in tickets on this car not in my name. One day, I get a frantic call from, who'd you guess, the man who sold me the car, who also miraculously learned perfect English, telling me that he was getting calls from the city and begging me not to let them tow it. I think at this point he realized what I was doing, and that he would get me the title that week, and the delay was because he and his wife were in a nasty divorce and she had the current title. I simply responded, "What car?" and hung up on him. As I was leaving my apartment, I saw the cops that were getting ready to load it on the tow truck and decided to let it go in case the former owner came looking for it. Ultimately, I never got my $800 back, but he got $2,000 in tickets, which would have turned into $4,000 if they went unpaid for 30 days, a $1,000 tow bill, and if the story about his divorce was true, a super pissed ex-wife because the car was still in her name too. You cannot put a price on that. Believe it or not, the story did not come from Prorevenge, but rather its still brother, Petty Revenge. I decided to read the story because scammers are horrible to deal with, especially in scenarios where the victim is living from paycheck to paycheck like how OP described their position at the beginning. However, even if the cash is not going back to your pockets, being able to rob a scammer out of at least quadruple of what they robbed from you, potentially with extra fees, and an angry ex-wife with whom they will eventually have to deal with, I believe that this story is at least deserving of being in this video. And with that, the sun has set on this episode. If you enjoyed it, then feel free to leave a like and comment below on whether or not you believe that the last story belongs in r/Prorevenge, or share a story of your own. And finally, subscribe to my channel to stay in tune for any upcoming videos. Until next time, my twinkling stars, have a good night.